long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Jay. So, like I said on the regular show, there was a bunch that we did not get to on our on that show, and I'm looking forward to talking about that, starting with Mitt Romney, who we will not have to kick around anymore, at least after 2020, January 2025, because this week he announced that he will not be seeking election to a second term. And Romney, of course, was the Republican nominee for presidency in 2012. But since then, or at least starting with the age of Trump, he's really become a more and more marginalized figure within his party. He was the only Republican to vote to convict Trump in the first impeachment trial, and only one of 7 Republican senators voting to convict Trump in the second impeachment trial. And in announcing his retirement, Romney, who's currently 76, said, "At the end of another term, I'd be in my mid-80s. Frankly, it's time for a new generation of leaders. They're the ones that need to make the decisions that will shape the world we'll be living in." And then later, Romney told reporters, "It would be a great thing if both President Biden and former President Trump would stand aside." So, Jay, surprised by this? What do you think about this? I mean, I would say you are something of a Romney-ish Republican. So what do you think about all this?
Romney-ish, I suppose, right? He wouldn't be my favorite. And I think in many cases, if you could have sort of Romney plus, right? A little bit a stronger Romney, a little more sure of his convictions. I would prefer that, but I am of the more of the Romney approach, I guess, right? Temperamentally, Romney, as opposed to the more fire-breathing types. No, I suppose it's not surprising. He's up there in age, although really looks good for 76, right? So, and I think he's, look, if I'm Mitt Romney and I'm 76, my God, if I'm not Mitt Romney and I'm 76, Mike, I'm not going to be wanting to do that sort of nonsense. So I understand it, and in doing so, he's able to make a statement about the 2 candidates for president that I think is a worthwhile statement to make. Although I don't think it changes much. Maybe not, right? Because there's been sort of the boomlet recently of talking about Joe Biden's age. So maybe it did something or sort of added to something that was already happening. Utah would tend to be a safe seat for Republicans, so I don't see it as there's any real risk of balance changing. It's another seat you have to defend, I suppose, but there's probably someone who would defend it even better than Romney would, right? It's not possible that he might have faced a primary in Utah. I would doubt it, but so no, I get it, and happy retirement. So
I disagree with Romney on a lot of policy issues, obviously. But what I feel like Romney represents is something I'm deeply in favor of, a thoughtful adult person who actually has a certain degree, I would argue, of humility, that hubris is not his kind of, and that really comes through. The Atlantic recently published an excerpt from his forthcoming biography, which, by the way, the example of this, he said to his biographer, I was thinking about publishing my memoirs. I've saved all this stuff, but I realized I couldn't be objective about my life. It's like, well, this is the kind of person I want, but he talked about that issue you mentioned of, well, I would hope when I'm 76, I can't imagine wanting to deal with this nonsense. And he said in this excerpt that, the Senate's like this weird plush club for old men who are so desperate to hang on to power, and they feel like without the Senate to give them their life's meaning, they would just wither up and die. So they're just so desperate to keep holding on to whatever relevance they have. And it just sounded so sad. And I'm but these are the people we have. And another example, he mentioned he was talking about the impeachment trials. And he said, well, you know what I did before the first impeachment trial? I said, I swore an oath to be an impartial juror. And so before the trial, I read Federalist 65 a number of times, which is, as Jay, you'll probably know, where Hamilton talks about impeachment, right? And he said, I read about I poured over the constitutional scholarship on this. I was trying to figure out what exactly a high crime and misdemeanor meant. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of all this, Mike Pence shows up at one of our caucus meetings to coordinate strategy between the jurors and the Trump administration. He says, "I was just bonkers." And I think, he has a point. He raised a point saying, aren't we supposed to be impartial jurors? And everyone looked at him in the caucus like he had two heads.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point to make, but it also indicates maybe a level of naivete that is one of the reasons why a lot of Republicans would have issues with him.
But I think it's not your point.
I could be pretty certain to say that the folks on the other end of the aisle who were meeting did not do that same sort of study of the Federalist Papers and the Constitutional Scholarship and sit around saying, I hope I can be an impartial juror. Look, would it be a better world if everyone was Mitt Romney in that case? Absolutely. So.
But I mean, I see your point.
I think. Here's the thing. Then this is sort of criticism, right? Is yes, you want someone who's idealistic, but you also want someone who can see reality and look at for what it is. Now, I would have disagreed with them on the first Trump vote, very much so. On the second, as I've said, my position would have been I would have convicted, but I would have convicted on something else that wasn't actually really offered, right? More of a dereliction of duty theory as opposed to insurrection. So, but that's neither here nor there. Because
but I think the problem is in that argument of, well, they're all completely craven partisans who are willing to rip up the Constitution to gain their political ends. So we'll be the same thing. I mean, that's the sort of nihilistic race to the bottom that ends in tragedy. No,
it could, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's also sort of the idea of unilateral disarmament isn't necessarily a good plan either.
I would urge Republicans to do that. Actually, it'd be a fine plan.
Well, maybe, yeah. Well, see, that you prove my point, right? If we had a caucus of Mitt Romneys who would just sort of walk, let you roll over them.
But I don't think so, because I mean, Mitt Romney was still pretty clearly a conservative, pretty clearly a Republican, and you can be a moderate, negotiating, kind of willing to cut a deal sort of person, right? I mean, and you take a look. So put those elements we talked about aside, there are very few people like Mitt Romney in terms of ideology in the Senate. I took a look at analysis of voting records, and basically, there are essentially, including Romney, 4, I would say, moderate Republican senators. There are maybe like 8 or 9 moderate Democrat senators, right? But that's a very big difference from what we used to see, and it's why it makes it so much more difficult to kind of find any sort of consensus or middle ground. And I think Romney will almost certainly be replaced by someone who's not nearly as willing to work with other people to try to achieve some sort of.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
And so I think you and I would agree that Romney's retirement is a loss to the Senate and a loss to the country.
I think so. Although I don't know, sometimes I'm again, I mentioned in our break off air, sort of how I'm whatever in a weird sort of philosophical mood today, sort of thinking these like bigger picture type things. I'm not sure. Is this just maybe a case of the older generation passing away and the new generation coming in, and they're going to do things differently, and it might be better. But it is just a shift of seasons, right?
How so? I'm trying to. You mean?
So I'm thinking back. So we did this exercise back in my high school honors government class. I had a really great teacher, Mr. Falk. I doubt he's listening, but if he is, well, hello. We did this survey and then sort of matched up our responses. It was like a role play sort of thing with a specific senator who was closest to our ideology based on this survey. And I don't think it was particularly scientific or anything, but the senator most closely matched my ideology. Maybe I could let you guess, although I suppose it's tough to think back of senators in the 1980s. I'll let you take a guess if you want to, but
I wouldn't have, like you said, I wouldn't have a.
It's tough to think back. Who's
Sam Nunn or someone like that? I don't know, but
God, he was a Democrat. No, the senator that at that time, based on my survey, based on most matched the political ideology of 17-year-old Jay, was Alan Simpson.
Wow. Okay.
Of Wyoming. And looking back and looking forward now, I would say he still is. I'm still sort of in that sort of Alan Simpson type. He was a big fiscal Republican. He was a deficit hawk throughout. He was strong on defense. He was sort of libertarian bent on regulation. I think he was certainly, coming from Wyoming, a Second Amendment supporter, but no one would characterize him as a gun nut. You know what I mean? So anyway, I just sort of think about, wow, how weirdly accurate that sort of was. Now, maybe you could say, a Bob Dole would have been probably just as close, or you said Sam Nunn, but yeah, even a Sam Nunn, right? And maybe it is just a generational thing, that those are the Republicans who used to inhabit the Senate, but they have passed on for good or bad. I would say probably mostly for bad, but that could also just be my age talking. And this is just sort of, to be expected. So my question is Romney's retirement a fundamental shift in political ideology, the way that the Senate works, or is this just part of a changing of a guard that's been going on and will continue to go on? And again, might not be a good thing, but it's just sort of the course of events.
Well, I would argue that there are two things to consider here, at least. One is the change in maybe policy viewpoints, the fiscal conservative sort of thing, like and maybe defense views and other things like that. But there's also, I believe, a difference in just approach and mindset thing. I think, I think there was a time when there were people who would say, I don't have all the answers. I'm not the smartest guy in the room necessarily all the time. And I think it's critical to any organization to have a certain number of those people in positions of authority. Because when you get too many people who are just entirely sure of themselves, then you run off the rails. You need those people who are raising questions of their own side to keep you in some sort of balance, to keep you from going off the rails. And I think on both sides, but particularly, I would argue in the GOP because of certain incentives in the electorate, perhaps, that you're getting less and less of that to the detriment of the country. So I think that's a fundamental difference, not just the difference in issue positions and so forth.
Yeah, and that's sort of my question, I guess. Is it just a generational change, or is it a political shift, or it certainly could be both?
Mm-hmm. I think.
But yeah,
maybe both, but. And anyway, I would recommend to folks, if you haven't seen that excerpt in the Atlantic, I thought it was a fascinating reading. Talked about all kinds of interesting stuff. He felt like the kind of like the Senate's like high school, and he felt like sort of the kid no one wanted to talk to, that sort of thing. And, there's a lot of good stuff in there. Pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to the book when it comes out. But I should mention, he also said that he talks to Joe Manchin all the time, and he says, I lobby continuously that he shouldn't run because it would only elect Trump. Obviously, Mitt Romney does not want Donald Trump to serve another term as president there. No surprise. And I think we can all agree that would be a good thing for the country as well. But all right. Any other thoughts on Mitt Romney before we move on?
Not really.
Okay. Anyway, so moving on to something very different. The day after the FDA approved the latest COVID boosters from Pfizer and Moderna, the CDC recommended that everyone over the age of 6 get this latest vaccine. And now new variants, of course, have emerged since the latest vaccines are formulated. The updated shots are supposedly closely matched enough, at least, to give strong protection, according to people who are supposed to know these things. And in the press release announcing the recommendation, the CDC said that in addition to the vaccine being safe, it provides the best protection against both COVID and reduces the risk of long COVID, which is a potentially debilitating condition that can last from months to years. And the Department of Health and Human Services says that somewhere between 7.7 and 23 million Americans have developed long COVID at some point since the beginning of the pandemic. And that is a serious thing, believe me. But while federal authorities have recommended getting the booster, the top health official in Florida, the third most populous state in the country, is advising those under 65 to not get the new boosters. Florida State Surgeon General Joseph Lopado stated, with virtually every walking human being having some degree of immunity, and the questions we have about safety and about effectiveness, especially about safety, my judgment is that it's not a good decision for young people and for people who are not at high risk at this point in the pandemic. This is a position that CDC Director Mandy Cohen called dangerous. Now, Lopado was appointed by Governor DeSantis in 2021. He's become one of the most prominent COVID vaccine critics, at least when it comes to near universal vaccination and boosting. And all this, of course, comes as DeSantis's campaign has attempted to use this COVID vaccine issue to gain some traction in his campaign to gain ground on Trump for the nomination, arguing that Trump should have fired Dr. Fauci, who, of course, many on the vaccine skeptical right have held up as practically the face of, evil big government mendacity and authoritarianism or something like that. So,
that's him.
There you go. And at this point, just FYI, Florida is currently 5th in per capita COVID hospital admissions, trailing Delaware, Missouri, North Carolina, and Washington, D.C. And Florida also has the 12th lowest booster rate of all of the U.S. states. So, Jay,
I would also, you should also probably adjust for Florida aging population.
Absolutely. A lot of old people in Florida, no question. That would be important to make those adjustments. But what's your take first on, I know there's a whole lot to say about the FDA approval and the CDC recommendation, but let's start with that. Any thoughts on that? We're getting into Florida?
No, not particularly. I guess it's not surprising that they would do this. They would make this recommendation. I think the FDA approval was not unanimous. I think there was a dissenter.
Like 13 to 1 or something.
Yeah. I said, 13 out of 14 scientists, Mike, recommend. But regardless, I think this is ought to be people's personal choice, and they should consult with their own doctor and read the literature and make a decision for themselves. I'm not one of these people who would say that the federal government is always right when they make these recommendations just because they're the federal government, nor would I say that they're always wrong. And if you're looking at, taking recommendations from, versus the federal government, which is just, some guy on the internet, well, I would probably say I'd stick with what the government says. But that said, I think there's enough question as to, people ought to make up their own on this.
We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo, we're @politicsguys, or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.